On the eastern coast of England, in a small Saxon village, a young woman named Aelwyn rose before dawn. She wrapped herself in a wool cloak the color of wet earth and stepped into the chill of morning. The ground was damp beneath her feet. Smoke rose lazily from cottage chimneys. Somewhere a dog barked once, and then all was still again. Aelwyn's world was small. A few thatched homes, a wooden chapel, fields that ran to the cliffs where the sea began. She had never traveled beyond sight of those waves. Her days were a rhythm, tending sheep, spinning flax, praying for good harvests and gentle winters. This video reveals one of the darkest and most tragic stories history tried to erase. If you want to uncover the pain buried beneath time, stay until the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon, because what you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. The North Sea was quiet that morning. A cold mist clung to the waves, and the sky hung low, heavy with salt and silence. It was the kind of stillness that comes before a storm, the kind that holds its breath before history exhales. On the eastern coast of England, in a small Saxon village, a young woman named Aelwyn rose before dawn. She wrapped herself in a wool cloak the color of wet earth and stepped into the chill of morning. The ground was damp beneath her feet. Smoke rose lazily from cottage chimneys. Somewhere a dog barked once, and then all was still again. Aelwyn's world was small. A few thatched homes, a wooden chapel, fields that ran to the cliffs where the sea began. She had never traveled beyond sight of those waves. Her days were a rhythm, tending sheep, spinning flax, praying for good harvests and gentle winters. Her people lived by the mercy of weather and time. They knew hunger. They knew loss. But they did not yet know the terror that sailed upon the wind. Far to the north, beyond the gray horizon, men were sharpening axes beneath a blood-red dawn. They were fishermen, farmers, blacksmiths, and killers. They called themselves Norsemen. Others would later name them Vikings. They came from the lands of ice, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, where mountains split the sky and the sea was both enemy and salvation. The soil there was thin, the winters merciless. Survival demanded strength and hunger breeds conquest. They built ships unlike any the world had seen, sleek, shallow, fast enough to ride both river and sea. Dragon-headed, their prows sliced through fog like blades. Each ship carried 40 men, sailors, raiders, believers in Odin and the gods of war. They believed death in battle was glory, and they believed the weak existed to be taken. It began in 793 AD. A monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, a place of prayer, peace, and quiet, saw the first crimson sails. The monks had heard of northern seafarers, but they were not prepared for the storm that arrived. The Vikings came without warning, their oars cutting water with the rhythm of war. They slaughtered the monks, burned the church, and took the survivors as captives. When the tide receded, bodies floated among charred crosses. The world of faith had met the world of fire. Word spread like smoke. Villages whispered of sea devils, of men who wore furs and iron, who prayed to no god but the sword. But Aelwyn's village, nestled far from great towns or armies, believed itself too small to matter, too quiet, too forgotten. They were wrong. That morning, as Aelwyn gathered her sheep near the cliffs, she saw movement on the horizon, dark shapes cutting through the mist. At first she thought they were whales, until the sunlight caught metal. The glint of shields, the flutter of red sails. Her heart froze. She ran, but before she reached the village, the horn sounded. A long, deep note, low and hollow, a sound like death calling across the sea. Villagers dropped tools, mothers screamed for their children. Men grabbed what little they had, old swords, pitchforks, stones. But against the Vikings, such weapons meant nothing. The long ship struck the beach with the grace of predators. Men leapt into the shallows, water splashing around their boots. Their shields shone with wet light. Their axes gleamed. They shouted words no one understood, yet every soul on shore understood their meaning. The raid had begun. Aelwyn saw her father fall before she reached him. She saw homes burning, heard the crack of axes against doors, the cries of the wounded, and the begging. To the Vikings, this was not evil. This was custom. A raid was the blood that fed their gods. The plunder, of gold, livestock, and captives, was their payment for survival. Historians later wrote that the Vikings were also traders, explorers, settlers. They built towns in Ireland, founded kingdoms in England, even served as guards in the Byzantine Empire. But none of that mattered to those caught beneath their blades. For the women of Europe, the Viking Age was not an age of discovery. It was an age of chains. Elwyn was seized as she tried to flee. A rough hand grabbed her by the hair, pulling her down into the mud. She screamed, clawed, kicked, but the man who held her was built like stone. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Around her, other women were dragged from their homes, bound with rope, thrown together near the shore. Children cried for mothers who could not reach them. Smoke rose above the village, a dark pillar against the pale morning sky. The Viking leader, tall, red-bearded, eyes like cold iron, walked among the captives. He chose with the ease of a man selecting goods, not lives, young women for the ship, older ones for the farm or the axe, the spoils of war, the silence of conquest. By nightfall, the village was gone. Only ashes and ghosts remained. The longships drifted back into the sea, their hulls heavy with silver, grain, and souls. Elwyn lay bound at the bottom of the ship. The smell of tar and salt filled her lungs. Above her, the sky was dark and endless. The oars beat a steady rhythm, a sound she would hear for the rest of her life. She watched the coastline fade into the mist. Every memory, her family, her home, her name, disappeared with it. In the distance, thunder rolled again, but this time it wasn't weather. It was history changing course forever. The world remembers the Vikings for their glory, their courage, their conquests. But beneath those sagas lie voices that never spoke again. Women like Elwyn, whose stories ended where someone else's legend began. For them, the storm was not the beginning of adventure. It was the end of everything. The sea was black that night. The longship cut through it like a knife through wet cloth, silent, ruthless, alive. Above, the stars shimmered faintly, cold witnesses to what humanity had become. Elwyn lay bound beneath a fur cloak, her wrists raw from rope, her breath shallow from fear. She had cried until her throat bled. Now there were no tears left, only silence. Around her, the other captives huddled together. Some prayed to Christ. Others simply stared into the dark, their eyes empty, their souls already far away. The Vikings did not speak to them. They spoke only to each other, gruff, coarse words in a language like stone and thunder. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they drank, but to the captives, they were as distant as gods and just as cruel. When dawn came, the mist lifted, revealing a world of gray and steel. The ship moved through the North Sea, passing small islands of jagged rock and seagulls that screamed like lost souls. It was said that Viking sailors could read the sea like scripture. They followed the wind, the patterns of birds, the color of waves, signs that told them where land and fortune waited. To them, the North Sea was not a barrier. It was a highway, one that connected entire worlds. Their raids reached the shores of Ireland, Scotland, Francia, and beyond. They plundered monasteries, burned villages, and turned rivers into graveyards of forgotten names. But for every sack of silver, for every jeweled chalice looted from a church, there were also people, chained, terrified, nameless, their lives turned into cargo. The Vikings were not merely raiders, they were also merchants of flesh. Captured men were used as laborers or soldiers, but women, especially young ones, were a different kind of treasure. They were sold across vast networks of trade that stretched from the icy fjords of Norway to the golden deserts of Arabia, from Dublin to Constantinople, from Hedeby to Baghdad. The Viking world was larger than most imagine. Through rivers like the Volga and Dnieper, they sailed deep into the heart of Eastern Europe, founding trade routes that linked Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. What they carried, furs, amber, iron, and slaves, fueled the growth of entire civilizations. The blood of their captives, spilled and traded, was the silent foundation of Viking wealth. On the second night of the voyage, a storm rose. Winds howled like beasts. Waves crashed over the deck, soaking everyone in cold salt. The ship lurched violently, and Elwyn was thrown against the side. A Viking shouted, a command, and the rowers dug their oars deeper. Through the rain, Elwyn caught glimpses of their faces, hardened men, soaked, fearless, almost joyful in the chaos. They believed the sea itself was alive, a creature to be conquered, not feared. They prayed to Njord, god of the sea, and to Thor, whose hammer split the sky. The storm raged for hours. When it finally passed, 2 captives were gone, swept overboard into the endless dark. No one spoke their names again. No one prayed for them. At dawn, the coast of Norway appeared, a jagged spine of black cliffs rising from mist. The Viking homeland, cold, brutal, beautiful. As the ship entered a narrow fjord, villages appeared along the rocky shore, clusters of timber halls and smoke rising into the gray sky. Men worked at forges. Children ran barefoot over stones. Dogs barked at the returning warriors. For them, the sight of captives was nothing new. It was proof of strength, a measure of honor. To survive in these lands was to take what others could not defend. The captives were dragged from the ship. Elwyn's legs trembled as she stepped onto foreign soil for the first time. The air smelled of pine and iron. Her hair stuck to her face, wet and tangled. They were led toward a large wooden hall built upon a hill. Inside, the firelight flickered across shields, spears, and furs. Men drank from horns, laughed, and struck each other's shoulders in celebration. Aelwyn saw women among them, Norse wives, their faces cold and unreadable. They did not look at the captives with pity. To them, this was simply the order of things. Aelwyn realized in that moment that her fate was sealed not only by men, but by an entire world that saw her as nothing more than property. The leader, the same red-bearded warrior who had captured her, stood before his people and boasted of his raid. He named the dead. He praised the gods. He raised his axe to the sky and drank to victory. When he spoke of the captives, the crowd cheered. They were wealth. They were power. They were living proof that the gods favored him. After the feast, the captives were divided. Some were claimed by warriors as servants or concubines. Others would be taken to markets, Birka, Hedeby, Dublin, where traders waited with silver coins and empty chains. Elwyn was chosen by the leader himself. He called her Prey of the Sea. She did not understand the words, but she understood the look in his eyes. She was no longer Elwyn of the coast. She was a possession. Historians today know this pattern well. Viking society was built on hierarchy: kings, jarls, free men, and beneath them the thralls, slaves. Captured people like Elwyn became the backbone of Viking life. They built their ships, they tended their farms, they bore their children, and through those children, the blood of the conquered quietly merged with that of the conquerors. It is said that by the 9th century, as many as 1 in 10 people in Viking lands were enslaved, a world powered by freedom and built on chains. That night, Elwyn sat in a corner of the chieftain's hall. Her hands were unbound, but she did not move. The fire crackled before her, casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. Outside, the fjord was silent again, as if the sea itself had swallowed her screams. For the first time, she realized that the gods of her old life had abandoned her, and in their place stood new gods, hungry, cold, and waiting. She did not yet know what awaited her in the days to come. But deep within her, something had already broken. The world she had known was gone, and she would never be the same again. In every Viking raid, there came a moment like this, when survival itself became a kind of death. This was that moment, the breaking point. The hall was dark except for the firelight. Smoke curled lazily toward the roof beams, and the air smelled of mead, sweat, and blood. Elwyn sat on the floor, her eyes fixed on the flames. They reminded her of her village, how the sky glowed orange as it burned. Around her, the Vikings feasted. They drank from horn cups, tore meat with their hands, and shouted in voices that shook the walls. To them, this was victory. To her, it was the sound of a world collapsing. The Norse believed the gods watched their every deed. Odin, the All-Father, saw wisdom in suffering. Thor demanded courage through conflict, and Frey, god of fertility, was invoked when men sought to claim women by right or by force. To understand what happened to captives like Aelwyn, one must understand this world, a world where violence was sacred and conquest was divine. For the Vikings, power was everything. It decided who ruled, who served, who lived, and who was forgotten. Women, even free-born ones, were often seen through the lens of alliance, married for land, traded for peace, used to forge bloodlines between clans. But for those taken in raids, there was no marriage, no name, no choice. The Norse word for a female slave was ambat. To the Vikings, an ambat was both servant and possession. They cleaned, cooked, and served their masters, and were forced to bear their children. In the sagas, such women appear only as shadows, nameless, voiceless, yet vital to the stories of men. They were the invisible thread that held the Viking household together, and the first to be forgotten when the tales were told. Aelwyn's days blurred into one another. She rose with the dawn to fetch water, to grind barley, to clean the hearths blackened from smoke. She learned quickly that disobedience brought punishment, a strike, a shove, a reminder that she was nothing. One evening, she was sent to serve mead at a feast. The men were already drunk, their laughter loud and slurred. As she poured their cups, one of them grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. He said something in Norse, a word she didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. Aelwyn tried to pull away. The hall went quiet. The warrior smiled, then struck her, not out of anger, but as if reminding her of her place. The others laughed. The chieftain did not stop them. To them, this was not cruelty. It was custom. The strong took what they wanted. The weak endured. It was the law of men, and perhaps in their minds, the will of the gods. Viking women, free and noble, often held surprising rights for their time. They could own land, divorce their husbands, even command ships in rare cases. But that freedom came only with birthright. For those enslaved, there was no law, no protection, no mercy. The same society that worshipped strong women in myth, shield maidens, goddesses, queens, turned living women into commodities. That is the hypocrisy of history, to praise strength while building power on the backs of the powerless. Outside the hall, the world turned to winter. Snow began to fall, covering the earth in white silence. The fjord froze over. The sea that had brought her here now lay still, a mirror for the stars. Aelwyn worked until her hands cracked and bled. She no longer wept. Her mind had gone quiet at a numbness that felt like safety. The other thralls whispered to one another at night in the shadows of the stables. Among them were men from Ireland, girls from Frisia, and even a boy from the east, a Slav, sold across the Baltic. Each of them carried a story that no one would ever write down. Historians have uncovered fragments of these lost lives, bones buried without names, chains found in graves, foreign ornaments hidden in Scandinavian soil. They tell a story of mass human trade, one so vast it rivaled the great markets of the ancient world. Archaeologists at sites like Hedeby, Rib, and Kaupang have found evidence of slave markets where men and women were sold like livestock. Prices were recorded in silver, and sometimes in the sagas, a woman was valued at the cost of 2 cows. The Vikings built their prosperity on such trade. Their silver coins came from the east, from Baghdad, Samarkand, and beyond. They traded amber, walrus ivory, furs, and slaves for silk, spices, and gold. The riches that filled their graves were paid for with human lives. Months passed. Aelwyn's hair grew long and unkempt. Her body grew thin. But inside her, something had changed. A quiet strength had taken root, the kind that grows only when everything else has been stripped away. She began to understand fragments of the Norse tongue, enough to hear when they spoke of her fate. The chieftain planned to sell her in the spring to traders heading east toward the markets of the Rus. Beyond the Baltic lay a world she could not imagine, rivers that led to cities like Novgorod and Kiev, where Vikings ruled foreign lands and dealt with Arab merchants. There, captives like her were sold again, sometimes to Byzantium, sometimes to the Abbasid world, where they vanished into palaces or harems never to be seen again. She thought of that often, to disappear completely, to vanish so deeply that even memory couldn't find her. One night she crept outside the hall. The snow was deep and cold, the moonlight sharp as a blade. For a moment she considered running. But she looked at the mountains, endless, merciless, and white, and she knew the truth. There was nowhere left to go. She sank to her knees, pressed her hands into the snow, and whispered a prayer to a god who would never hear her. The sagas never told her story. They celebrated men who conquered, not those who were conquered. They sang of ships, not chains, of glory, not grief. But every Viking victory carried a shadow, and in that shadow lived thousands like Elwyn, unnamed, unseen, their suffering written only in silence. The horror of the Viking Age was not only in its bloodshed, it was in what it turned ordinary people into, men who believed cruelty was destiny, and women who learned that survival sometimes meant surrender. The fire in the hall dimmed to embers. Elwyn lay awake, listening to the crackle of dying wood and the whisper of snow against the door. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the beginning of another nightmare. Winter passed like a fever. The snow began to melt, and the rivers broke free from their frozen silence. The earth, once buried beneath white stillness, breathed again. But for Elwyn, there was no thaw, only a deeper cold, one that lived inside her bones. She watched the men repair their ships. The same ships that had once appeared like demons on her horizon. Long, narrow vessels with carved dragon heads that now waited for the sea to rise again. To them it was a sign of renewal, the season of voyage and conquest. To her, it was the season of loss. In the Norse world, everything was cyclical. The seasons, the raids, the births, and the deaths. They called it word, fate, a web woven by unseen hands. No one escaped it, not even kings. But fate, Elwyn thought, was not written by gods. It was written by men, and men were cruel storytellers. The hall had grown quieter since the raids. Many warriors had left, taking with them new captives, new wealth, new scars. Only the old, the children, and the thralls remained. Among them, Elwyn began to change. Her voice, once silent, returned in whispers. She learned to barter her labor for small kindnesses, an extra scrap of bread, a few moments of warmth by the fire. In a world built on domination, even small mercies became sacred. Historians often write of the Viking Age in numbers, dates, battles, conquests. But beneath those records lies another history, an invisible one, the quiet suffering of those who endured rather than fought. When the raids ended, the survivors did not return home. They became the forgotten, absorbed into a culture not their own, buried under centuries of myth and glory. At dawn, Aelwyn would walk to the river to fetch water for the chieftain's household. The cold bit into her skin, but she learned to ignore it. She began to memorize the land, the shape of the mountains, the rhythm of the waves, the places where wildflowers grew through frost. It was her way of remembering that beauty still existed, even in a world built on pain. Sometimes she would meet the gaze of other thralls. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their eyes said everything words could not. Fear, endurance, a quiet kind of defiance. Some historians have suggested that, over time, captives could earn a strange kind of freedom. If they bore children, if they proved loyal, they might one day be treated as part of the household. Some even married their masters, rising slowly from property to personhood. But freedom born from ownership is not freedom at all. It is another form of captivity, one that hides behind acceptance. And yet, it was survival. For some, that was enough. The Norse sagas, though written centuries later, hint at this complex truth. They speak of women who were once slaves, but became the mothers of kings. Children of captives grew up to inherit the blood of both victim and conqueror. It was through them that the cycle of pain quietly continued, woven into bloodlines, remembered in silence. Elwyn's belly began to swell as the snow melted. No one asked whose child it was. No one needed to. The women of the hall, even the free ones, looked at her with a strange mixture of pity and fear. They understood the language of survival. They knew what it meant to be claimed. The child she carried was a life born from the collision of worlds, a symbol of power and of sorrow. At night, she would rest her hand on her stomach and wonder what kind of world her child would inherit. Would it belong to the north or to the ashes of the home she once knew? In those same months, far from the fjords, Europe trembled under the same shadow. Viking fleets struck from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, raiding Paris, ravaging England, even reaching the gates of Constantinople. Behind every victory, the same pattern unfolded: burning villages, stolen wealth, and captives carried into a life without name or country. Records from the Abbasid Caliphate mention blonde-haired slaves from the north sold in the markets of Baghdad and Samarra. To those merchants, they were exotic, valuable, a curiosity wrapped in tragedy. The Norse called this the Ostvegar, the Eastern Way, a river route through forests and frozen plains that connected Scandinavia to the vast empires of the East. Aelwyn's fate was part of that great, unseen network, a human current flowing through the veins of medieval trade. When the spring came, the longships returned to the water. The men sang as they loaded their cargo, timber, fur, iron, and people. Aelwyn was among them. She was chained again, this time alongside strangers. Her child was not yet born, but she knew she would give birth on the journey. The sea stretched out before them, cold, endless, merciless. She thought of her mother's hands, of her village, of the smell of wet earth after rain. All things she would never see again. The Vikings saw the ocean as freedom. To them it was the path of destiny, the road to glory. But for their captives, it was a grave without soil. Many never reached their destinations. Storms swallowed ships whole. Others perished from hunger or sickness. The sea took them silently, burying their stories in the deep. Aelwyn survived, barely. Her ship drifted for days after a storm, its crew weak and half mad. When they finally reached land, she was no longer the same. Her child was born that night, a boy pale and small, his cry lost in the sound of waves. She named him in her language, a name the Vikings could not pronounce, a name that meant light. For years she had lived in darkness. Now even a fragile light felt like defiance. Her captors would never understand. To them, she was still nothing. But to her child, she was everything. Centuries later, historians would debate how many like her lived and died unseen. Thousands? Tens of thousands? The bones unearthed across Scandinavia offer no names. Only traces, iron collars, worn teeth, broken wrists. They cannot tell us who these people were, but they whisper the same truth. Empires are not built by heroes alone. They are built by the hands of those history chose not to remember. Aelwyn stood at the edge of the sea, her child in her arms, the horizon red with dawn. She did not know where she was, but she knew one thing. She had survived what should have killed her. And sometimes that was enough to keep walking. Centuries have passed since the fires burned across the north. The Viking ships are long gone. Their sails, once black against the horizon, exist now only in sagas and songs. But beneath the ground they walked, beneath the ruins of their halls, lie the bones of the forgotten. Men who fought, women who served, children who never knew where they came from. History remembers the conquerors. It names their kings, their explorers, their gods. But it is silent about the ones who were taken. And yet, without them, the Viking Age would never have risen as it did. By the 9th century, the Norse world had changed. The raids grew into something larger, a network of trade, settlement, and power stretching from the Atlantic to the Caspian Sea. In the ruins of York, once called Jorvik, archaeologists found silver coins from Arabia, amber from the Baltic, and shackles worn smooth from use. Every piece told the same story, that human life was the most valuable currency of all. The Vikings did not simply take lives, they reshaped them. Captives became settlers, slaves became mothers, and children of mixed blood became heirs to new worlds. In Icelandic sagas, there are traces of these unions: a woman from Ireland, a girl from the East, a boy whose eyes were not as blue as his father's. They were woven into the family trees of men who had once enslaved them. That was the hidden legacy of conquest. The blood of the conquered flowed silently through the veins of the victors. In later centuries, when Scandinavia turned to Christianity, the old gods faded. Odin's ravens fell silent. Thor's hammer became a relic of another age. But the sins of that pagan past, they could not be buried so easily. Monks who wrote of Viking raids spoke of the horror that fell upon their monasteries. They wrote of men slain at the altar, of women dragged into ships, of cries that echoed long after the raiders had gone. Their words were filled with fear and fury, but they also carried something else: witness. The survivors ensured the world would remember the pain, even if it forgot the faces. Historians today uncover the truth piece by piece. At the trading port of Hedeby, bones of young women were found, their origins traced through isotopic analysis to lands far beyond the fjords, the British Isles, the Baltic, even Central Europe. Their teeth told stories of migration. Their wrists showed signs of restraint. They were not Vikings. They were the ones the Vikings took. Each discovery pulls another ghost from the soil. Each name recovered is a defiance against the silence of centuries. Aylwin's story, though unrecorded, was not unique. For every chieftain who ruled a hall, there were dozens of captives tending his fire. For every voyage that returned with silver, there were faces in the shadows who paid the price for that wealth. Yet time and its cruel indifference erased their voices and elevated those of the men who silenced them. It is easy to remember the warriors, harder to remember the ones who could not fight back. But history is not made only by heroes. It is made by everyone, forced to live through them. Some scholars call this the Invisible Empire, a network of unfree labor that stretched across Viking settlements. From Dublin to Novgorod, from the fjords of Norway to the fields of Iceland, slaves built, harvested, sailed, and bled for the glory of men whose names still survive in runes. Even centuries later, after the Viking world faded into legend, their descendants still carried that invisible scar, a lineage half forgotten, half denied. In Iceland, sagas like Laxdæla and Egil's saga mention Irish and Celtic women among the first settlers. They were rarely described with names. Instead, they were simply taken. And yet, through their children, their stories endured. Modern genetic studies have revealed that a large percentage of Icelandic women descend from Gaelic ancestors. Proof that behind every voyage of discovery was a voyage of suffering. Science now whispers what history refused to shout, that the bloodlines of conquerors are built upon the conquered. As for Aylwin, her name would not appear in any record, but her blood might have survived. Perhaps through her son, born on that cold northern shore. Perhaps through generations that followed, their origins forgotten, their features reshaped by time. Maybe somewhere in the north today, a family bears her echo without knowing it, a fragment of a story buried beneath centuries of silence. That is the strange mercy of time. It buries the pain, but not the truth. The winds change, the gods fall, but the past always leaves a shadow. When historians look into the graves of the Viking world, they do not find glory. They find reminders that even the mightiest civilizations were built on the suffering of those they conquered. The sagas will always speak of courage, but the earth beneath them whispers something else: cost. The legacy of the Viking Age is not just ships and swords. It is the story of power and what power does when no one dares to stop it. Aylwin's voice may have vanished, but her silence remains, a silence that stretches across time. Asking a question history still refuses to answer. What is victory? If it is bought with the destruction of the innocent, time buries everything. The screams, the prayers, the names. But beneath the silence, some echoes never fade. They remain in the soil, in the bones, in the quiet places where no songs were ever sung. This is where history speaks in whispers. And if you listen closely, you can still hear them. The ones who never had a voice. The Viking Age ended nearly 1,000 years ago. The longships stopped sailing. The swords turned to rust. The gods fell silent. Yet their legacy lingers, not in the sagas carved on stone, but in the silence of the nameless. The women who vanished into captivity. The children who never knew their homes. The men who watched their families taken and lived with the weight of survival. They do not appear in the history books, but they exist in the spaces between sentences, in the pauses where chroniclers stopped writing, because the truth was too heavy to record. We often speak of the Vikings as heroes of discovery, adventurers, explorers, but behind that romantic image lies a darker truth. Every voyage of discovery was also a voyage of destruction. Every new world opened was another world burned. To glorify the Norse without remembering their victims is to paint over blood with gold. Some say the past is gone, that the dead cannot speak. But in truth, the past is not dead. It breathes through us. The languages we speak, the nations we live in, the faces we see in the mirror, they are mosaics of every triumph and every atrocity that came before. Aylwin's story may seem distant, but it is closer than we think. Her pain lives on in every forgotten woman of history, in the enslaved, the silenced, the displaced. The ones who built empires they would never be allowed to claim. From the markets of Baghdad to the fields of Iceland, from the ashes of Constantinople to the coastlines of Northumbria, their suffering fed the rise of civilizations we still glorify today. That is the echo of time. It never stops asking, who remembers the forgotten? Archaeologists still find traces of this lost humanity. A broken comb carved from bone, a silver ring with foreign script, a child's tooth buried beside a Viking grave. They tell a story beyond glory, a story of connection and consequence, of how violence travels not just through swords but through generations. For every empire that rose, someone else was buried beneath it. And yet, amid all that darkness, there is something quietly human, the will to endure. Even in chains, people dreamed. Even in captivity, they sang softly to their children. That is the part history cannot erase, the persistence of the soul. Elwyn's light did not die with her. It became part of the long memory of humanity, a memory that refuses to forget suffering, even when the world moves on. The Vikings are gone, but their stories remain carved in the bones of Europe. Their language shapes our words. Their blood flows through millions. Their myths still breathe in our culture, from the names of planets to the stories we tell of warriors and gods. But the story of their captives, the women, the children, the enslaved, that story belongs to us, because it reminds us what happens when strength becomes cruelty and conquest becomes faith. Every civilization has its shadows. Rome had its slaves. Greece had its conquered. Even today, the world hides new forms of servitude behind prettier names. History does not repeat, but it rhymes in the same hunger for power, the same blindness to pain. And if we do not listen to the echoes, we will become them. Maybe one day, someone will stand where Aylwin once stood, at the edge of a cold sea, watching the horizon and wondering what stories lie beneath the waves. Maybe they will remember that even the smallest life can change the course of history, not through power, but through survival. Because to endure is its own kind of victory. Time will keep moving. Empires will rise and fall, but the echoes remain. Every scream, every prayer, every silent act of courage, still vibrating, still asking to be heard. And perhaps that is why stories like this must be told, not to glorify the past, but to remind us that humanity's greatest sin has always been forgetting. This was The Lost Chapters, where history's forgotten voices are given one last chance to speak. If their echoes reached you, share them, because memory is the only justice time can offer.